10 and one for chapter 11. So that way you can kind of not have to watch the whole chapter 10 slides if you want to get to chapter 11. And so that's kind of how I split it. So when you see different things on there, it will have to do with how the material was split. All right, so chapter 10 dealt a lot with the output part, right? How do we measure output or production? Right, and we talked about the most popular measure is the GDP. Right, and if we look at output for the country, that's GDP. And if we divide it by the number of people, that kind of gives us average income for a country. So that's the way we talk about output. We mentioned GDP deflator in chapter 10 just because that's kind of an easy place to put it. However, it's not the most popular measure of inflation. If you hear inflation on the television, the radio, you read it online, more often than not, the variable they're using is something called CPI. So what we're going to do in chapter 11 is we're going to talk about what is CPI, how is it calculated, what it's used for. We're going to spend a whole lot of today focusing on the first part. Next Monday, we'll cover the rest of these parts. What are the problems with it? How does it differ? How can we use it across time, across cities? And then how do we correct for things like interest rates with inflation? How do we correct for inflation? So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk kind of about what is the CPI, how do I calculate it? So the Consumer Price Index is a measure of the overall cost of goods and services bought by a typical consumer. So what does the typical consumer buy? So we do this is so that way we can look at how are prices changing across time. So what we have to do, there's no slides. Let me try this again then. Sorry about that. Let me try this again. Can you see the slides now? Thank you. Sometimes I think I present them and they go away. All right, so sorry about the slides. I'll go back a slide. Nothing there really. Just an outline of what the chapter is. And as I said, we'll talk about the first one today. What is CPI and how is it calculated? So by definition, the CPI measures the cost of goods and services bought by the typical consumer. What does the typical person buy? And we do that to try to monitor changes across time. The CPI is measured through something called the BLS. It's the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They have two kind of important measures in the US economy. They measure the CPI, and they're also going to be measuring the unemployment rate when we get there. So the BLS does two things. It measures the Consumer Price Index and it measures the unemployment rate. So if you ever want to find this information, you would go to bls.gov and all that information is there. Both the Consumer Price Index and the unemployment rate are calculated monthly. So they're calculated a little more often than the GDP deflator. So this is one of the reasons we use the CPI is it's done more frequently than the GDP deflator. So what's been popular probably in the last 10 years is they don't use the CPI. They use a part of the CPI, which is called the core CPI. Now, what's the difference between the core CPI and the regular CPI? What happens is with the core CPI, what they do is they pull out food and inflation. Sorry, they pull out food and energy. Why food and energy? Well, because if you notice the price of gasoline or the price of food varies a whole lot. Well, if you look at other prices such as, let's say, television services, they kind of move up gradually. You don't pay different prices for internet service each month. It kind of moves up in a slow, steady pattern, while food and energy tend to fluctuate kind of wildly. Right? So go into the store and look and see what grapes cost. They could cost $1 a pound this week, and they could go to $2 a pound next week. They fluctuate. Most of you have no problems understanding gasoline prices go up and down quite a bit. So what the goal of the core is we say, well, these fluctuate an awful lot. So let's pull them out of our discussion. And oftentimes what they're also doing is they're driving other parts of the CPI as well. So we pull them out to try to give us this kind of idea of what the base is happening. Doesn't mean we ignore one or the other, but most of the time now economists use kind of this core to make decisions about what to do about inflation. We still measure both and we still report both. But a lot of times policymakers about inflation are looking at the core CPI. So let's talk about how we calculate the basket. First thing we do is fix a basket. So anytime that you're going to work a problem, you will be given this information. As I will tell you what the basket is. Okay, I will do the BLS's job. I will go out and I will survey the customers and the consumers and whatever economy I make up, and I will tell you what's in their basket. I will then give you the prices. I find the prices as well. So I go out and I do all the data collection. So I shop for all the prices and tell you what the prices are. So I do step 1 and step 2. You will be often required to do step 3. As I will say, okay, given the basket, given the prices, what's the cost? Well, how do I find the basket cost? Well, it's just like a shopping cart. Right? I told you what's in the shopping cart. I told you what the prices are. You're the checker. You tell me what the prices come out to be. So if I tell you there's 2 pounds of chicken and they're $5 each, you go, well, 2 times 5 plus 1 package of hot dog, that's $2, plus 4 pounds of apples that are $1.50. All you would do is you would go and you would add up the basket cost, and you say, well, Dr. Walshire, the basket cost is whatever that price comes to be. So I will ask you to compute the basket cost, not hard. The next thing is I will give you the base year, right? This is information you will be given. And when you're given the base year, you can compute the CPI. Now, how we do the CPI is we take current basket divided by base year basket, and we multiply by 100. Just like the GDP deflator, the CPI is in what we call an index variable. That means it has no units. So you don't put a dollar sign on it, you don't put a percent sign on it, you don't put a pound sign on it. What you put on there is just a number. The CPI is just a number, so it's just 100. It's just 120. There's no units associated with it because we index it. And then once we have these indexes, we can compute the inflation rate. And we compute the inflation rate as we always have computed growth rates. New divided by minus previous over previous. So this year minus last year divided by last year. And that will always give us what the growth of prices is. And the fancy word we have for growth of prices is the inflation rate. So let's work through the problems. As I promised, we were going to work through some more problems. So here's the information you have. Right? I did step 1. Right here. I did step 2. Your job, step 3. So what is the cost of the basket? Well, the cost of the basket, well, I would do 10 times 12 plus 5 times 18 Now I got 210. I hope that's what everyone else got. Then you would do it for 2018. You would do 10 times 14 plus 5 times 20. I got 240. 10 times 16 plus 5 times 22. 270. So here's the answers. So hopefully you got the same thing I did. And that's kind of, as I said, part 3 will be sometimes your responsibility. So here's how you would find the cost of the basket. Not difficult. It's kind of how you find what cost you when you check out at Walmart. All right, so now let's calculate the CPI. So what did I tell you want to look for? Is you want to look for the base year. Boom, I found it, 2017. Okay, so what I know is 2017. I know the base year basket cost will be 2010. Sorry, the base year cost is 210. So let's find the CPI for each year. So let's do the CPI for 2017. Well, I take the current basket cost divided by the base times 100. And what we notice is what we always notice about base year and indexes. CPI in the base year, just like GDP in the base year, will always be 100. So if you're given a table of CPIs, you can determine what the base year was used. Right? So if I gave you a table of CPIs, you could go and say, oh, Dr. Welsh showed 2017 is the base year because it's 100. And that's how you would calculate it. And that's how you would know. So you do 2018. 2018, you take 240 over 210, multiply by 100. Get you 114.3. And you would do the same thing for 2019. I would do 270 over 210 times 100. And that gets me 128.6. So here's kind of how they did it, and it should match up exactly, hopefully, with what you did. Next thing you want to do is find the inflation rate. And how do we do that? We simply take the new minus the old divided by the old times 100. So for 2018, it's 14.3. For 2019, you should get 12.5. And that's how you would calculate it. 128.6 minus 114.3 divided by 114.3. I cannot tell you how many times students forget to divide the number. They just subtract, and that's what they tell me the inflation will be. They forget to divide. Because I am that professor that will have on there the inflation rate for 2019 is 14.5. Sorry, not 14.5. I will have on there 14.3. How did that come up with 14.3? Well, I just simply subtracted the two. And that is the wrong answer. I can tell you right now that will be on there. I can tell you right now, if I was asking 2019, the choices would be 14.3, 28.6, 12.5, and then I don't know, I'd probably put out there 2.0. And I would ask you to find it. And the only proper answer is the one we use the formula to find, 12.5%. Okay. I am not going to put up there, I'm not going to try to see if you can round correctly and put like 12.4, 12.5, 12.6. I'm not testing your rounding skills. What I'm going to test is, do you know the formula and can you apply the formula correctly? Okay. And if you try to use a shortcut, it will not work. Always go back and use the correct formula. So what does it look like for the actual BLS? So what does the CPI look like? So this is what the actual kind of basket is made up of. So if I asked you to think about your budget, and I said, all right, sit down, think about where you spend money. Now, sometimes for college students, it's a little more difficult because housing sometimes is taken care of for you. If you live with your parents, you don't think about the housing cost because they're paying it. However, when you go out to live on your own, and when I ask adult students who are living on their own, they're like, yeah, housing's the most. Then it's transportation, food and beverages, medical, education. Now, again, remember, this is for the average consumer. This is the average 40-year-old. Where do they spend their money? Now, for students, well, you might spend a little bit more, say, here and not so much here. Okay? You probably don't spend very much here. Well, some of you might, but if we looked at the average student, they're going to be different. So remember, the CPI looks at the average, kind of think about it as the average American. And again, we know since the averages, there's going to be different people. So sometimes, a lot of times, the discussion with CPI is that right now we use the CPI to, we'll talk about it again later, to index for the Social Security. However, the problem is older people probably don't have the same budget makeup as younger people. And so it might be faulty to use the CPI for the general population for the older people. However, we use the CPI, though, to determine the taxes that we're going to get from the younger people. So to fund Social Security, I have to tax the younger people that are susceptible to the CPI. So it becomes a difficult balancing act, right? Everything's going to have a cost and benefit. So which way are we going to allocate goods and services? How do we index for inflation when not everyone has the same budget? And we know that, but the goal of macro is we know their people are different. We know this doesn't apply to everyone, but I have to come up with an average. I can't have 300 million different CPIs where I just look at what you buy and sell each month. I have to do it for the entire economy. So we do a lot of averaging here. So we have to look at things that trying to look at it at a big picture. And because of that, we always typically focus on the averages. Yes, and we know that's not perfect, but you got to do the best you can. You have to figure out your costs and benefits and what we can and can't do for things like inflation and how we measure it. So let's work up one more problem before we go today. We have about 15 minutes, so we're pretty good here. So what you're going to do, and I want you to do, is I want you to calculate the CPI for all the years. And then find the inflation rate for 2018 to 19. All right, so first couple of things. Here's my basket. Here's my base year. So if it was me, and what I would do is I'd have a sheet of paper. And I would find the basket cost. All right, so first thing I do is find the basket cost. 30 plus 60. $80 plus 100. All right. I hope I did that right. Looks right. So the CPI then for each year. So the CPI for 2017. Sorry. 90. So CPI for 2017, I can do that one in my head. That's 100. Why? Because it's the base year. So the base year, or if you wanted to do it correctly, it's 90 divided by 90 times 100. So for 2018, do 120 divided by 90 times 100. And then finally for 2019, what we do is we take 80 plus 100. So we take 180 divided by 90 times 100 and gets us 200. So here's the answers to it, which hopefully we all did correctly. And then finally, how do we find the inflation rate? I take new minus previous divided by previous times 100 should give us the 50%. All right, so there's a second part to this. So if we think about this basket, if we think about how people behave, so what do we notice in 2019? Well, we noticed in 2019, the price of beef skyrocketed. Well, the price of chicken barely went up. Well, it went up, but it went up by not as much. So if this was reality, what would happen in 2019 for the average consumer is they wouldn't still be buying 10 beef and 20 chicken. No, we would substitute, or our demand or our quantity demanded would change. So as the price of beef went up, what should we expect to happen to quantity demanded of beef? Well, if the price goes up, we should expect the quantity demanded of beef to go down, which is what it did. And if the quantity of beef, if the price rises more for beef than it does for chicken, then the demand for chicken should increase because it's a substitute. And when demand increases, so does price and quantity demanded. So we're now at this new point where we have 5 pounds of beef and 25 pounds of chicken. Because in reality, that's what happened. However, the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't change it. Why? Because they don't adjust the basket. The basket has to stay the same because we want to look at how things alter over time. However, in reality, it doesn't for us. So what we do is we go back and we're going to calculate this new basket because the basket changes in 2019. And what we noticed when we did that is our CPI comes out slightly smaller. Instead of it being 200, it is 183.3. And when we solve for that, we see that the actual cost to the consumer isn't 50%, our basket didn't change by 50%. The cost of living didn't change by actually 50%, but 37.5%. But the CPI is going to report 50%. So what's going to happen then on Monday of next week? What we're going to talk about is this issue. Is why is prices differ? And does the CPI overstate or understate inflation? And why do we care? So are there any questions in kind of